Grant Swartzwelder. I'm president of OTA Environmental Solutions and with ESG Dynamics. And on behalf of both organizations, really appreciate your participation in this YouTube or webinar. As you recall, we record all of these presentations and save them on YouTube. We now have enough followers that we were able to name it Oilfield Strong, and so that's what you would search to find the video. In July, we did not have a live presentation because it happened right at July 4th. Instead, we released an interview that we did with Michael Schellenberger, who is a pretty outspoken visionary about environmental issues. So if you're interested in hearing some pretty thoughtful comments about environment, energy, electricity, you should go onto our YouTube and hear his presentation. With that, I'd like to introduce our speaker today. Fantastic timing to have this individual on. Director Bruce Baizel has been with the New Mexico Environmental Department for almost 3 years, initially serving as general counsel, and then in the last 2-3 months has been transitioning over to compliance and enforcement director. Before that, he had been with Earthworks for 17 years, and so comes with a vast amount of knowledge on the environmental side and New Mexico and regulatory side. As you might recall, we had interviewed his boss, Cabinet Secretary James Kinney, about 6 or 8 months ago. So he kind of, Secretary Kinney gave more of an overview, where with Director Baizel, we're going to talk more directly about enforcement and compliance and kind of what's happening in New Mexico from that standpoint. So welcome, Director. We'll throw you a good softball question, and if you would kind of have some general comments about kind of what's happening in New Mexico from a environmental department standpoint, from a kind of compliance and enforcement, starting to see more fines. I don't know, more fines, but it seems like becoming more active. Is that the case, or am I just now paying attention?
Thank you, Grant. No, that's fairly accurate. The secretary came in a few years ago, and we're now through his first term as a cabinet secretary. He came from an enforcement background, and that's where I met him years ago in that context. And it takes some time with an industry this established to try to get things to where people understand what they're supposed to do, and that we have the mechanisms in place to remind them of what their obligations are. And then when we don't see that, them meeting those obligations, then we start to look at enforcement to try to get them back into compliance. And that's certainly been from the governor on down, that's been an important area of emphasis. And I think what you're seeing is sort of the culmination of several years of work to try to both encourage operators to be in compliance, and when they're not, then it takes a while to make sure we have the data and the understanding of what happened, so that with some of these fines you're talking about, we were at the point where we went public with them, and now we're sometimes, I guess you could say it's unfortunate, but to be honest, at least in a couple of these, we just didn't see even a semblance of paying attention to what the regulations required. And we saw some business decisions that were made, even knowing that they were against what was required in the regulations. So that's, I think, goes to maybe the size of some of those fines that you mentioned.
Okay. Walk me through kind of, and I know this could be a lengthy conversation, so maybe a compressed version of, somehow you find out about a situation, and it sounded like in one case it was some neighbors, but is that typically, how does a situation like this start? It goes through an NOV, then kind of what's that process? And again, we've got operators on, so partly I'm trying to help them understand kind of how this all happens and what the process is.
Well, I think there are generally three ways that an instance like this might move from an NOV into an administrative compliance order, and then with a couple of them, we've gone to signed consent decrees. So the complaints that you mentioned, our regulations do allow for us to take credible evidence complaints. So that could be someone with an OGI camera sending us a film showing emissions coming off of a tank on a facility, for example. Or
would that be normally you or someone in your organization, or is that an environmental advocate group, or just anybody?
It comes down to, the critical word there is credible. So if they could be an outside group, an individual, if they have, a standard OGI optical gas imaging camera, those are technically very sound. If we get that, then we can accept that, and that can lead into an NOV if we then substantiate it. So that's one route. We have inspectors, not lots of them, but we do have inspectors that go out and they will look at sites, and if they observe something, then they can also file paperwork that says we think there's a violation. And then the third route, and that's where a couple of these came from, we've been cooperating with EPA on doing flyovers, and that can be often with helicopters. And so then we look at the video and data from those flyovers, and we discuss with them which ones we think rise to the level where we really need to take some action. So there's quite a bit of coordination, and that's been going on since 2019. So that's a third route in which we will some of these violations and ultimately settlements and fines can begin.
And with that, does EPA provides the data then through the helicopter flyovers and then kind of hand it over to y'all to do the, I guess, enforcement or the analysis of it?
We talked together. They had the funding and the equipment to do that. That wasn't something that we could afford to do by ourselves, but we did it. We discuss it once they've done it, and both up in the northwest part of the state, but down in the southeast in the Permian, and then they're doing that some on the Texas side as well. So it's not just New Mexico, but it's I would say that the technical staff get together and evaluate those videos and that data, and we decide, okay, division of labor, which ones are in New Mexico? Are they big enough that we can handle them, or should we let EPA handle them? That kind of discussion goes on.
And then take it to that. So you identify these videos and take it to the next step. So your group, say y'all decide to take it over, do you send a demand letter or what's the next steps on that?
Well, usually there'll be a request for information to the operator of that specific site, saying, this is what we think we saw, and asking for further information, clarification. And then based on that, we can either, we have to do a little bit of our homework, saying, okay, let's take this data. What's it say? What do the regs say? What kind of permit do they have? Where are they located? And so on. And then if we think it rises to the level where it's a violation, then we would send out a notice of violation to the operator.
And then once they get NOV, and this is kind of a thing I think would be helpful, is how should an operator respond to that NOV? Obviously forthrightly and truthfully and all that good stuff, but if I get an NOV, what do you suggest they do, and how's the best way to handle that?
Well, actually, I mean, to me, there's a fundamental pre-step to all of this based on what we're seeing out in the field and the attention both at the federal level and also interest of our governor in this, but it's doing your internal evaluation as an operator to make sure that you're as best you can be in compliance, knowing that we are doing these flyovers. We have inspectors out there. Next year, there'll probably be some satellite data available. I mean, if you're in the business that puts emissions out, you really need to do that self-assessment, because for the big emission events, we're probably going to see that, and that's probably going to result in a violation. So I always like, that pre-step, that pre-review is very important, and that can reduce both issues down the road, but it can also help then if we send an NOV and you get in touch and say, hey, this is what we think was going on out there. Either we think your data is wrong, or we actually have taken care of that already, or we've corrected it, whatever. Those are all factors that go into then what do we do about that NOV? And in the case of at least one company where we had a consent decree, they did made a lot of effort post NOV, and were very cooperative and timely in what they did. And that affected the size of the ultimate penalty fine. Whereas with another company, we were looking at 6 months of not doing anything at all. And just sort of, well, gosh, we didn't know, and, back and forth, and there were big emissions and all that. And so consequently, that fine's a lot bigger. And so it does matter how you get back to us and what you do about it. We can still end up disagreeing about some things, but there's a process for dealing with that, a hearing and whatnot. But that response after an NOV does matter in terms of how we will handle it.
Is it fair to say that if you do get an NOV, you're most likely going to be paying some type of a fine?
I wouldn't say I wouldn't say it's automatic. No.
Okay. So how do I avoid not paying a fine?
Well, that's why I say that pre.
Okay. But if it reaches the point of getting the NOV,
effort is to avoid it in the first place.
Sure. And that's always the best.
They're small, these are highly technical, complex facilities, and stuff is always going to be leaking. I just know that. We had a ranch for years, and the water system always had leaks in it. It's equipment wears out, seals never hold fully. I mean, that's true on any mechanical system. So it's really when it gets to be what's significant, and have you tried to do maintenance throughout? That regular maintenance matters. Those kinds of things feed into whether are you going to get a fine? Is there going to be a fine, and how big would it be? That all matters.
And how NMED compares to the OCD? It seems like the OCD is more about filing permits and documentation, where NMED is more about actual physical emissions. How bad did I butcher that?
So that's a pretty good description of the division. We don't permit sites, to drill. What we handle is the emission side.
Okay. So you mentioned, one more on that. It seems like on some of them that you have settlement agreements, and then you have consent decrees. When you go through the NOV and get settlement, are you ultimately going to get both of those, or both of those are worked, or do you do consent decrees on some? And how's the resolution kind of come about, and what type of form does that take?
I think that's really case specific. With a couple of these consent decrees, it's been both EPA and our department, as well as the operator. And that often will be a consent decree under the Clean Air Act. But it really is case by case. It kind of depends on what has happened and what kind of permit was involved. and what level of emissions. So.
Okay. And so you've alluded to a couple of different players, and there's been a couple of big kind of announcements that y'all have made. One that was around $6 million in total fines, and one significantly higher in the 40 range. It seemed like the wording on the 40 was a lot different than the other one. You use words like egregious and things like that. How do y'all, how do you look at one versus the other? And you've kind of alluded to it some, but how do you look at these different companies, and why did one get so much more than the other one, and that type of thing?
Well, the amount of emissions matters. The amount of time it takes for there to be some kind of corrective action taken matters, and the level of cooperation matters. I would say those are probably the three primary factors in that kind of, I mean, we do have we have published our penalty guidelines on our website, and so you can gauge things generally, but within that, those are the kinds of things that go into what is the actual amount, and what kind of language would we use. We were, as you're alluding to, on the one larger penalty, we value compliance, and we weren't seeing that in this instance, and I guess you'd say we weren't happy campers.
Well, and with that, when you also in the press release talked about their private equity backer, and which was kind of strange. I hadn't seen that on others where they went back and talked about the capital providing. Was there a reason for that, or obviously there was, but what caused that to happen? And are y'all starting to look at the capital providers or the partners that these companies have as being a kind of a co-defendant, if you will?
Well, I don't think they would actually be co-defendant, but
yeah,
I think at least in my experience, the structure of the industry has changed some, and so we have, whereas you used to have long time industry veterans that were running companies and had been, they kind of knew the system itself, and now we're getting more outside finance that is come into the industry, and sometimes those folks we find don't know the ins and outs of how a system works. And so I think this was one of those where we felt like we needed to communicate both with the folks that write the checks as well as the folks that do the field operations.
And you kind of alluded to this, but are you seeing more issues with that kind of private equity backed company, or it just happened to be in this particular case?
I wouldn't say, I don't know that we've looked carefully at compliance from the standpoint of who the owner is. It was just in this instance we were a little baffled by some things, and kind of said, well, in our experience, longtime veterans wouldn't have done some of these things.
And again, I'm not trying to shame anyone or call, but can you give like maybe some specifics of kind of what were they doing that either was egregious or we should learn from?
Well, I think those three factors that I mentioned all play in, the amount of time, the amount of the volume of emissions, and the level of cooperation.
Okay, fair enough. It's and then once you the other part that I found interesting comparing these couple companies, the one that got the smaller fine of the $6 million penalty, only a 1.1 was actually a fine. The rest was obligating them to spend money on flyovers and equipment, and kind of where the larger one was all fine. And I guess, again, you were making a point by that versus saying, okay, we'll work with you and you can spend some money fixing your stuff.
Well, I think it's important to note that the first one that you're referencing was actually a final agreement between ourselves, the EPA, and the company. And with this, the larger one that you're mentioning, we've simply issued that as a proposed fine. We haven't reached an agreement yet. So
Okay.
it could be that they would say, if we reach agreement, okay, we'll do these things above and beyond
Okay.
what's regulatorily required in order to recognize that we put out all these emissions. That would be the kind of discussion that would go on.
Okay. And so it could evolve to that, kind
Absolutely.
of like, well, okay.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Very good. And the various fine money that goes to the state, how is that money used? Does that go into general coffers, or is that used back in the environmental, or because that starts adding up to be real money?
Excuse me.
No problem.
Excuse me. So in the area of oil and gas emissions, there actually is a fund that some of this money would go into, but the general rule is that fines, penalties go into the general fund. So it varies by which part of the department we're dealing with as to where that money goes.
And I noticed in May y'all put out a press release for Oxy and EOG, kind of doing looking at some kind of enforcement watches. Is that just kind of putting them on notice, or what does that mean versus? It didn't seem like there was necessarily a okay, here is a fine. It's just more of these guys need to watch out. Is that how that works?
Yeah, and I think those. I'm glad you mentioned them, because we have a regulation on the books, and it's an issue down in the Permian, and specifically when you drill through some of those formations, there's some radioactive activity in some of them. And that tends to build up as scale or sludge on pipes and in tanks. And the regulation that's on the books, I actually brought this for those that may not have seen it. It's a different section of the regs. It's not the oil and gas regs per se. But those two companies did the testing they were required to, and they actually had radioactivity in the sludge that they needed to deal with separately. And they needed a specific facility that was permitted to handle that. They didn't get that done, so we had some discussion with them, and now they're modifying their procedures so they do it correctly. But enforcement watch is a way to just put the word out there. Hey, this is where we have a compliance issue on this company for this reason. Once it's resolved, then we also put that note in there. So it goes up when there is a notice of violation issued, and then it's when it's resolved, then we note that as well. And it just puts the word out that we're paying attention to compliance and enforcement. And in general, we find that tends to focus people's attention, and we get better compliance overall.
And so those two companies, obviously, and then the two we've alluded to are all of them are fairly sizable companies. I'm always interested in the little guy. And there's, because these larger companies, they have staffing for regulatory, and they have facilities engineers, and they have budgets that can, but a lot of these smaller producers just seems like they're at a disadvantage because of the weight of the regulation and the amount of money, and they tend to have more marginal wells. And does the state, can the state help them, or feel any obligation to help them, or how do these smaller companies deal with the weight of all this? And I'm sure they're worried about the environment, but at the end of the day, they've got a marginal well and a low overhead or no overhead for this type of thing. So how does New Mexico deal with that, or NMED kind of address that type of situation?
Well, for example, in our ozone precursor rule, we actually have a section in there for small producers that would cover this type of operator. And there are, I would say, slightly less stringent requirements in terms of looking for emissions leaks and things like that, either in terms of frequency or in terms of how they actually need to look for those emission leaks, and that recognition that I think we used a definition based on revenues and number of employees to kind of get at that particular segment of this industry. Say, well, we understand that. I think we're also seeing some adaptation in terms of maybe cooperative efforts across producers, where they're going in on with a third-party contractor who can survey several of them at once, and it cuts their costs. So I think that's also another route they could go.
You know, one of the things I always wonder about, that these larger companies, because of their staffing, they tend to have been able to do the analysis, do the evaluations, and all of that intellectual knowledge sure would be helpful to the smaller guy. But seeing that transfer of information, that knowledge, that's easier said than done, it seems like. But
yeah, that's true in a number of industries. This one isn't any exception to that.
You know, and this might not really relate to you, Director Baizel, but on the Inflation Reduction Act, there's all this money being talked, like millions of dollars that is being talked about for methane reduction, and some of it being allocated by state. And I would think New Mexico, with the amount of production it had, would get a pretty decent chunk of that. Do you have any idea how that's going to be? I know it's early stage, but any idea of how that'll be handled within the state of New Mexico? And you know, because I think some of that could be funds that could help these little guys. But
I think specifically there'll be methane funding coming from the federal government, looking primarily at voluntary adoption and use of methane capture technology. So I think we will see that.
But it sounds like it's too early to really know how that's going to really play out, or how folks can get their hands on those funds. Or
yeah, they've just said they're going to do that. They haven't set up the actual fund.
Hard to believe the federal government's not just speedy as all get out. So
well,
it's no, that's well, good. Well, we're right in our time, so we try to be punctual. Anything, Director Baizel, that I've missed that you'd like to, either a commercial for NMED, or something that I've missed that you think would be important, whether it's at ozone or waste rule or any of those other rules? Or, you know, I'll give you the last word.
No, I think you've been pretty thorough in your questions. I think I don't know that we're not planning on any new rulemakings in the near future, so we're just going to try to do the best we can with what we have and see what comes from the federal side. I think they may do some things, but
I'm going to say this with a smile on my face, but I would think there's some of our attendees that would say, y'all have already done more than your yeoman work on creating rules, so you don't need to do any more rules.
Well, it's you got to digest what you've got sometimes.
Isn't that true? And communicate it. So,
yep.
Well, good. Well, Director Baizel, again, appreciate it. I think this is very helpful for people to understand kind of who you are, what you're doing, and how it's going to affect the industry, because clearly with some of the fines that have been out and flyovers, it's here, and it's here in a big way. So appreciate your time and in providing that overview.
Well, happy to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
Very good. Everyone, appreciate it. We'll be having another one in the 1st of September. Announcements will go out in the next couple of weeks of who the speaker is. Thank you very much, Director Baizel. Thank you. Everyone, take care.